instead of a traditional lecture, what Brian and I talked about is making it more of a conversation. So I'll ask him some questions. We'll talk about the future of journalism, talk about what he does at the New York Times, and take it from there. After about 35 to 40 minutes of our conversation, we'll open it up to Q&A from the audience. So please feel free to think of some questions that you might have for him. Before we get started, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about him. In 2004, Brian Stelter forwarded his passion for television news into a blog called TV Newser. Within months, the site became the go-to place for news about the news. One acknowledged by the likes of NBC's Brian Williams and Jonathan Klein, the president of CNN's domestic operations. By 2006, Jeffrey Schneider, an ABC News executive, said of TV Newser, the whole industry pays attention to his blog. And I should mention that he did this by the time he was 21 years old, before graduating from college. Shortly after writing a profile of Brian, the New York Times invited him in for a series of interviews, and after graduating from Towson University in Maryland with a degree in mass communication, he became a media reporter for the Times. He now blogs regularly for them at the Media Dakota blog, and his stories have appeared on the front page of the print edition. If you looked at today's edition, he had a story in the business section about changes to the Nielsen rating system. He was also featured prominently in the 2011 documentary Page One Inside the New York Times, which we'll be showing a couple of clips from today as part of our conversation. And he just finished your first book?
Yep.
His first book?
Hopefully my first book. I mean, that's very presumptuous. But there will be a second, hopefully.
Yes, I'm sure there will be many more to come. It's titled Top of the Morning Inside the Cutthroat World of Morning TV, which will be published this May by Grand Central Publishing. It is my honor to introduce Brian Stelter of the New York Times.
Thank you.
To get us started, what I thought I would do is show this clip about you. It's a short clip from Page One. So Gary, if you wouldn't mind showing it.
Probably the only known journalist to create a blog and then go to print media.
Here was this kid, 21-year-old Brian Stelter, who started a blog, who did it anonymously so no one would out him. The New York Times outed him as a mere kid. He made his brand and his reputation by just getting out there and blogging.
You know, he became this sort of must-read for the Brian Williamses of the world, and I think the Times had the idea, we're not going to hire this guy.
A week after that story was published, the Times contacted me and asked me to come up and do the series of interviews back to back to back with editors, seeing and hear the Times material, I guess.
You see him at his desk, and he's got 2 laptops and TVs open, and he's twittering, and he just embodies everything about new media.
I don't know why anybody who's a reporter isn't on Twitter. I constantly berate my colleagues who aren't on it. It drives me nuts when I'll hear about it, and I'll hear my colleagues talking about a story at noon, and I read it on Twitter at midnight. I'm thinking to myself, why is that allowed? You know, why are we not on top of the news? It's 2010.
I still can't get over the feeling that Brian Stelter was a robot assembled in the basement of the New York Times to come and destroy me.
Okay, so my first question is, are you a robot?
I wish. He actually added that line to the movie late because he started saying it on college campus visits, and people laughed, and it kind of perfectly embodied the gap between people like me who grew up on the internet, who were in their 20s, and people like him who have belatedly embraced the internet, who are in their 50s, who have to figure it all out, you know. And even though it is a funny line, it does show some of the anxiety, I think, that older reporters feel, somewhat fairly, somewhat unfairly, about these younger reporters that are coming in. But thankfully, we have quite a romance now going on. Partly thanks to the movie. We kind of became closer during the filming of the movie, and now we're quite close.
So if you would talk a little bit about that, being someone who's a young journalist whose background started online, going to one of the most storied news organizations. How has that been? How has that transition gone? How have you been accepted by the other people in the newsroom?
It's gone much more smoothly than I would have guessed it would. It's been about 6 years now, almost 6 years. So much has changed since then in terms of the internet, in terms of publishing, in terms of journalism. When I came into the Times, I was rather intimidated by it. I was 21 years old, and there weren't many people like me that were around yet. There were relatively few young people and relatively few web people, the website was still run in a different building. I mean, that's how different things were. That now the website is run in the center of the newsroom. It has literally taken over the center of the building. So it's very symbolic of how things have changed in the last 6 years. But even when I arrived in 2007, people were welcoming. There wasn't the ageism that I was expecting. I was kind of fearing that. I think people were they just didn't care. Like, they didn't care enough to have bad feelings about me or concerned about me. You know, they were just doing their jobs. I got there. I had no idea how to write for a national newspaper, so I put my head down and tried to write a lot of stories and figure it out. And after a few years, I started to look around and think, okay, this is a good place for me. This is the right fit. And in some ways, I kind of went backwards. I went from new media, I went from the web, from blogging to the print newspaper. But what I realized was that to get promoted, to get noticed, to get raised, basically, I had to write for the print paper. The print paper was still the big product, the main product, and in some ways it still is, although that's changed as well.
Why don't we go back and start from the beginning? So
Sure.
For people who are not familiar with the TV user aspect, can you talk a little bit about how you got that started and what motivated you to do that, and sort of what became your process so that by the time you're 21, people are viewing you as your go-to site?
My first semester in college, I was bored. I went to school at Towson University outside Baltimore, and I had made some friends, but I hadn't. I didn't have a lot to do on the weekends. I suppose I was still going home to my mom's house on the weekends, and I was looking for something to do, some project to do, because I had always been a web geek, creating different websites in my spare time. I was lucky to be born at the very, the moment in human history where anyone could become a publisher. I guess before about 1995, there was a real barrier to entry to publishing. Even if you were publishing a newsletter, it still cost money to get it out. Never mind to buy a printing press and have a newspaper. But starting about 1995, anybody could publish if you knew HTML code online. I was 10 years old at the time. I created a web page about Goosebumps books. I hope some of you know Goosebumps books. I love them still. And then I grew up out of Goosebumps books, and I started a website about Nintendo games, and then I grew out of Nintendo games, and I created a site about Xbox games. And the commonality through all that was I was doing something journalistic. It wasn't journalism, but it was kind of had the feel of it. It was gathering information about the games that were coming out and writing reviews of what I thought about the games and stuff like that. I kind of grew out of Xbox too, though, and in college I was kind of looking around, what do I want to create? What would be fun to write about? Well, I was obsessed with television news. I loved CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and I realized there was no blog for people like me who were interested in it. If you think about it, there's a lot of things like that where it'd be great to have a blog about something. I would love for someone to do a full-time blog about Fox News. It still doesn't exist. I would love for someone to do a full-time blog about my neighborhood in New York. There's a couple of them, but not the perfect one. So there's all these voids that could be filled. I'm sure there's ones here in Springfield of blogs that could be done about certain issues. So for me, it was TV news. For me, it was cable news, and I started this blog in January of 2004, kind of just because I thought it'd be fun to try to do. Not thinking I would get a job out of it, but thinking that I would learn about television a little bit. Back then, I still thought I wanted to be a TV anchor. I realized, as my hair started to go, I probably wasn't going to become Brian Williams. I mean, even Matt Lauer wasn't, he started to fade up there as well. And I started to realize it was more interesting to write about TV than to be on it. A lot of what people I looked up to, like Brian Williams, are doing are reading the newspaper every night on TV. They're reading the newspaper on TV, and I thought it might be more fun to write about them. So the blog kind of gave me a path forward. It gave me a job, but that wasn't the plan. The plan was just, this is an interesting topic. Nobody's blogging about it. Maybe I can try it.
How did you develop your sources as somebody? We talked a little bit before this about how would people take you seriously when you said that you wouldn't be viewed as a kid, but viewed as
I figured I had to do it anonymously because no one would take me seriously. I was 18 years old. Why would anyone read my blog about CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC if they knew I was 18 years old and doing it in between classes at Towson? So for about 6 months I was anonymous, but people came to the blog and gave me story ideas, emailed me ideas, and most importantly, I put a little box in the corner of the page. You'll see this on sites now. It's become kind of common, an anonymous tip box, where you could write whatever you wanted, just send me a note, and I would get it. And no fingerprints, no trace, you know. That way, if you're at NBC or Fox and you wanted to leak something to me, and you didn't want your bosses to know, you could leak to me. You could send me a tip. And that thing was genius in retrospect, because it was the easiest way for people to give me feedback. Complaints, compliments, insults, and once in a while, actual great story ideas. So I would get this stuff incoming from people. I would try to filter it. I would try to post what was true. I would start to talk to the networks and ask them, is this true? Is this untrue? It kind of start to do journalism, actual verifying of information. And after about 6 months, as I built up an audience for the blog, I realized I can't be anonymous forever. I've got classes. People were starting to figure out that when I went away for 3 hours in the middle of the day, that kind of felt like a class schedule. Like they started to pick up, and I kind of accidentally dropped clues about Baltimore in the blog. But people were starting to figure it out. Like the Washington Post emailed me thinking they were on to me. So I decided to come out, so to speak, and reveal who I was. And what surprised me at that point was that people continued to take me seriously because I had built up credibility just by blogging so much and by getting the facts mostly right. I mean, sometimes I find quantity is a substitute for quality. If you're not going to be the best at it in the whole world because you're young or because you're new to it, then just post a lot. And sometimes just doing it more than anybody else is going to get you to that point. 10 or 12 items a day. Some will just take 2 minutes. It was just, you know, why did that anchor not show up for work today? Like, who is this new person? Or, wow, CNN really fucked that up. And that kind of stuff. People love that stuff because it's like a bulletin board. Every industry needs a bulletin board. Some have it, some don't. Everybody needs it. The Wall Street Journal is a bulletin board for the business world, basically. And my blog, TV News, became that for television, kind of without me even trying to make it that, because everybody at the networks wanted to huddle around it and talk and use me as a way to talk. And so that's how I ended up gaining their trust and credibility, just by posting a lot and by trying to get it right. So if I made a mistake, I would correct it and I would publish it in bold letters. I made a mistake. You know, and I think in some ways, admitting to my mistakes gained me more credibility by correcting myself and saying, I screwed up, here's why. People realized that they could trust me, that if I made a mistake again, I would fix it, rather than cover it up. There's too many people online, even today, who still try to cover up the fact that they screw up. And I think that only loses you trust. It doesn't gain you trust.
So how has that transition gone for you? You know, there you were posting 10 to 12 items about TV news, and now here you are at the New York Times.
Yeah, couldn't be more different.
So can you tell us a little bit about your routine now?
Yeah, when I graduated college in May of 2007, the Times hired me, and they basically hired me to blog. I think what they wanted was a TV blogger, someone who read about all of TV, from CNN and Grey's Anatomy to like the Weather Channel, do the whole spectrum. But when I got there, like I said, I realized to get promoted to advanced, I had to write for the paper more. So I really gravitated more toward the print paper. And now, all of us at the paper, whether you're a print reporter or an online reporter, it's all the same now. So almost all of my stories start on the web as a blog post, and they become stories in the paper later. The boundaries are really blurred. So I start my day between 9 and 10. It was a little later. I'm a late sleeper, depending on what's going on that day. If I'm writing a story for that night's paper, then that's the priority. But oftentimes there's stuff that just creeps up during the day. Yesterday I wrote 4 blog posts, and 2 of them became print stories. And that's really, I think, most of the time that's how it works. It's kind of like and you know this from your research as well, that the newspapers are becoming the best of the web that day. They're becoming the highlights of the news of the website. So in my case, 2 of my blog posts were worthy of print, 2 of them weren't. And I improved my stories for the paper thanks to all the feedback I got from the web, from people who were reading on the web. And then other days you're working on a longer term assignment, so I'm not really blogging. It really varies day by day. But on an average day, I probably write a couple of blog posts, and then some of those get into the paper.
You used a term that I thought was interesting. You said, I wrote a couple of blog posts that were worthy.
Worthy, yes.
So is print still privileged at the New York Times and Terror of the Saints?
It is.
That's the real stuff. The stuff online, it really isn't.
Well, listen, the spokesman for the New York Times would say, which I'm not, would say that we have the same standards on the web as we do in print. And for the most part, that's true. We do not post things on the web without checking them, without verifying, without being as sure as we can that they're correct. But by virtue of the fact that the web is always on, that we can always update it, we publish sooner, we get more information later. We might post a story saying someone has resigned before we know why, and then we'll add the reason why later. And I think that's common on the web. That's how the web should work. It should be improving all the time. Stories should be improving all the time. But when I say things are worthy for the paper, I suppose there is still, at the end of the day, a value that's put on a print newspaper story. If you work at a place that's printed a newspaper for 150 years, you're going to tend to value the copy you can hold in your hand more. And as a practical matter, we still make most of our money from the print edition. So even as we're trying to transition to the web, print is still, at the end of the day, treated as the most important product. But you can see that slowly changing. Page One, the film that I was in 2 years ago, takes its name from the Page One meetings that we have every day. I'm not allowed into the meetings. It's only for the top editors. It's like this secret conclave. It's very mysterious. And in those meetings, 10 a.m. and 4 p.m., they decide what's going on the next day's front page. And that's the fact that we still have those meetings really shows that the front page is still the most important thing we do. But we've moved those meetings earlier in the day. They used to be at 11 and 4:30. Now they're moving earlier because they're about the web as well now. Because the first thing that happens at 10 a.m. is we talk about what's already online, what can go up early, what can go up soon. And so in those meetings, as with the rest of our day, the web comes first, and then print kind of is the finished product.
Well, that might be a good transition to the next clip that I wanted to show. This is another scene from Page One that has to do with reporting the WikiLeaks story. This was one of the first big scoops for WikiLeaks. And the video I was showing there.
This is my fat money.
Website which calls itself an intelligence agency for the people. And yesterday I posted this video of a U.S. attack, an aerial attack, where there were 12 people killed. The government claimed at the time that these were insurgents, but it turned out there were 2 Reuters employees and then some other unknown people. WikiLeaks somehow, from an anonymous source, gets the video and puts it on YouTube. It felt like a possible front page story to Bruce and I. So now, basically the assignment for the rest of the day is to keep the story interesting to editors.
We're trying to do a front page story on what this means and what this means for journalism. I mean, clearly it's great for journalists in some ways because then it's out there. It's this conclusion of 2 worlds, like this sort of closed old world of expertise and classification and information and privacy, and this new world that just kind of wants to crack it all open. We see it ourselves. We're a perfect example of a kind of culture that is having what we do completely ripped open. So it's. Hey, did you send it? Okay, yeah, I got it. Yeah, thanks, bye. These are watching people get killed in an incredibly graphic way in a war and hearing the reactions of the soldiers.
I didn't see that the van flips over. I noticed that last time. God, what a fucking terrible story. Here's the nut graph. The release of the Iraq video is heaping attention on the Once Obscure website, which aims to take advantage of the global reach of the internet and bring to light hidden information about governments and multinational corporations. They didn't have to drop this off on the front step of NBC News or the New York Times. They just dropped it off on YouTube and waited for everybody else to find it.
I thought that's interesting that how things have changed. Did you know at the time that you were working on that story that WikiLeaks would become what it did? Did you have any thought that that would be the case?
Only a very vague thought at that point. WikiLeaks then became a much bigger part of the media narrative. I'm glad we wrote about it early on. And it really, to me, WikiLeaks is a great example of the most disruptive force happening in journalism today, which is, I think, sources going direct to the public. And that takes all sorts of shapes. Whenever we see Red Bull, a energy drink manufacturer, create a television show, that's sources going direct. They're going around the media. Or when we see President Obama have a Google Hangout or a YouTube chat, that's going around the media, sources going direct to the public. And WikiLeaks is another example of that. If you're a whistleblower, you can leak something to WikiLeaks, they'll publish it online, and that's a way to go around the media, so you don't have to give it to the New York Times. And that's sort of the theme of that comment at the end there is, they didn't have to drop it off on our doorstep and wait for us to decide if it's news. They decided it was news, they put it online, and we had to chase it. I think that's a really good thing in some ways. That video of the Reuters reporters being gunned down along with other, who knows who they were really, in Iraq, that video probably wouldn't have gotten as much attention if it had been dropped off on the front door of ABC News. By putting it on WikiLeaks, it forced ABC and the New York Times and everybody else to care about it. And that's a good thing. I mean, I wish we could see a lot more of what happens, in our war zones. But there are many downsides to it as well. And one of them, as I think we also address in the film, is we don't know the motives of the people who release this stuff, who leak this stuff. So to me, sources going direct is this huge thing we have to wrestle with as journalists. We can, yes, it's in the future, presidents and politicians and celebrities, they're all going to go more directly to the public. Even Kim Kardashian, think about it, she has a blog. Why would she talk to the New York Times if she has news, if she can put it out on her own terms? Our challenge as journalists is going to be to annotate that news, to explain what it is, why it matters, what they're not saying. Sometimes the most interesting thing about presidents and politicians and celebrities is what they don't say, and journalists have to fill in those blanks. But it's a challenge for us, and I think WikiLeaks is an example of that challenge.
Well, and the clip we didn't show is when you're doing the interview with Julian Assange, and he thinks of himself as as a journalist.
That's right.
That's right. But it's a journalist with an agenda.
Right.
Where does that put someone, that traditional, verified, objective journalism, that model of objectivity? Is that still relevant in this age?
It's relevant if the public decides it's relevant, and some have decided it is, and some have not. I think to overgeneralize, I think as a country we are heading toward going back to the future, which is toward a more partisan media, toward more outlets that have a clear point of view. Some Democrats, some Republicans, some conservatives, some libertarians, some radical liberal, everywhere in between, and some with opinions just about certain topics. A focus on the environment, a focus on on gun control, and who knows what else. I think it's probably a good thing overall for the country. Our media probably got a little boring for a few decades. To me, there are great advantages to having a Fox News and an MSNBC, and having both sides debated every night. But there are some flaws with that as well, huge flaws. One is that if you're on Fox News in prime time, I've been attacked by Bill O'Reilly before, which is interesting when that happens. The problem with that is Bill O'Reilly doesn't invite you on to talk to you about it. He just attacks you. He's not trying to get to whatever your side is. And the same is true at MSNBC lately. On the left, they are attacking conservatives, criticizing Republicans. Not necessarily. In some cases, they bring them on and talk to them. Rachel Maddow tries really hard to book those people. But for the most part, you're not hearing them actually talk when they're being criticized. That's why we need a nonpartisan media as well. It's fine. I think it's fine to have a lot of opinionated media out there. I think it's in some ways really good. But we're going to still need the New York Times and many others like it to do the rest of the work, to do the rest of the reporting. Because partisan media, almost by definition, isn't going to. We're going to need the New York Times and others to make those phone calls and ask those other questions.
Do you feel like, getting back to your earlier point, that people are going around you, so that there are sources, especially politicians, that would say, oh, well, Bill O'Reilly's going to be nice to me. He's not going to ask me questions on the air. I'm not going to talk to Brian because he's going to ask me the tough questions, so I just won't talk to the New York Times. Are you running into that more as you're doing
I think the media is in general. I think it is. You mentioned I just finished a book about morning television. It'll come out in May. It's mostly about the Today Show versus Good Morning America. It's the best rivalry on TV. It's crazy what they do. And during the reporting of the book, Ann Curry was fired from the Today Show and replaced by Savannah Guthrie, and there was this national craziness that happened. And ever since it's happened, Ann Curry can't talk to me. Matt Lauer won't talk to me. Most of the people involved in NBC are declining to talk. But sometimes they do post on Twitter, and sometimes they do talk to celebrity magazines, because those are safer venues for them. My job is twofold. Number one, to take note of what they do say, because it still has value when they tweet or when they talk to us weekly or people. But number two, to go around them, to go to their friends, to go to their colleagues, to go to their former colleagues, to go to their neighbors, and figure out what I should know, even though they won't talk. It makes our jobs sometimes harder, but kind of more interesting, kind of more fun. To me, I had more fun going around Matt Lauer and going to his friend. I'm going to try to be vague here, but like going to his friends and his co-workers and getting the dirt that way than I would have gotten from him. So I do think in some ways sources go indirect, even though it challenges reporters. It may end up in better stories.
Do you find that, is that a skill that is being lost? The shoe leather idea of saying, you know what, okay, I'm not going to this source, but it's harder for me to get this story because now everything is on Google and you can Google everything.
I don't think I'm optimistic in this regard. I don't think it's being lost. I can see why some people may think that, but I think there's a lot of people out there, some who are, quote, journalists, and some who are just normal people who are just curious about the world. I mean, to be a journalist, you got to be curious. And I think so many people are. Even people who don't fit that traditional journalist description, they just want to know, they just want answers to questions. So they end up creating a blog, or they end up creating a Twitter account and pestering people for information. That's great. The fact that people can do that now is great, I think. And the great thing about journalism is when you don't get answers, when you get stifled, or you get people get in your way, or in my case, if Ann Curry won't talk to me, gets you angry, gets you irritated. You gotta go find the answers. It's motivation. when you hit a roadblock like that, it's motivation to try harder. And so I don't think that'll go away. I think sometimes younger reporters needed some encouragement to go do it. There's certainly times where from my editor, I've needed a little bit of a shove to get out there and try harder. But hey, that's what coaches are for in every profession. And as long as we retain some of that journalist-editor relationship, I think we'll be okay.
How about television news? How would you rate the state of television news now? You're covering it, pretty much since 2004. So
Yeah.
we've got about a decade of looking at television news.
I sound like feel really old when you say that.
What's your critique?
With the caveat that I'm a little skeptical about television news in general, I'll tell you. Television's tricky because most Americans get most of their news from television. It is the most important medium by far, and I say that as a newspaper guy who wishes everybody read newspapers. They don't, and they're never going to. Television is the most important medium by far, and I really respect what they have to do because it's hard work. My girlfriend's a traffic reporter on television, so she gets up at 3:30 in the morning, and she has to. I think I have deadlines for articles, but you know what? She has real deadlines because she's not in front of the camera at 5:08. There's no report. It's blank air. So I have a lot of respect for how hard the job is and how difficult. That said, we've seen dramatic reductions in the amount of reporting that happens on television. And this is probably something I have not covered enough. I have not written enough about. We've seen real reductions in the number of boots on the ground, in the number of foreign bureaus, for example, in the number of even local reporters at stations. We've had tremendous cutbacks to local television station reporting. And I think that's probably a bad thing for people who are interested in what's going on in the world. Look at Afghanistan, for example. This is a stereotypical example. Whenever you want to describe the lack of news reporting, you've got to go to Afghanistan. You've got to think about Afghanistan. The networks employ about one reporter each. They're usually not even on the payroll. They're usually freelance reporters who can move around whenever they want to. Sometimes there's no reporter in Afghanistan at all for the networks. That's crazy. That's irresponsible. It's shameful, really, if you think about it. We should have daily reporting from that country. But viewers don't seem to want it. There's not a demand for it among the public. So the networks do what they do. And it makes sense business-wise for them to do what they're currently doing. I would say that whenever I get frustrated by the lack of television news reporting, whenever I get frustrated by the cutbacks, whenever I feel like they're just doing the bare minimum they need to get by, whenever I turn on local TV and I get frustrated by the amount of crime coverage, and crime in America is dropping, but coverage is rising. I mean, and as a result, public polls show people think crime is a big problem. Record lows, actually, in most cities. There's real frustrations about those issues, but whenever I get annoyed, I think to myself, that's what the internet's for. I mean, that that is the great equalizer, the internet. People can get so much more and so much richer information online than they can ever get from television. And television's having to grapple with that. I think television's having to figure out what is our role now in a world where everything we want to know wakes up with us in the morning on our cell phones. For my book about morning TV, it's a real interesting kind of conundrum. I mean, if we wake up with our cell phones, and many of us do, right? We're charging our phones usually, like, my phone sleeps with me in bed, right? Which is weird, I guess. But a lot of people are doing that, and especially a lot of younger people. Then what's the point of a morning television show? It's not to give you the news headlines anymore. It's not to give you the weather. It's not to give you the traffic. Probably morning television becomes about personality, about friends, about having a party, something to wake up to that's fun and lively. But it's a real challenge for all television news. And I think part of the answer with the internet challenging them is they got to bring us the pictures. You know, television's still the best at bringing us dramatic live pictures. The cruise ship last week in the Gulf of Mexico was the best example recently. I didn't realize how crazy that cruise ship story was until I saw the live pictures of that boat, you know, moving at 1 mile an hour through the Gulf. So, I get frustrated by the lack of TV news coverage, lack of reporting that happens, but I think that it's an important medium because most people still tune in, and the internet in some cases is the solution to whatever problems exist. That was a long answer, forgive me. Does that make sense?
It does.
The internet can be our salvation in many ways.
Except the only thing the issue I would raise and ask about is you've got a lot of isolated pockets. So there's so much fragmentation on the internet that maybe that voice that has the correct thing that's really going on in Afghanistan doesn't have the drive.
Right.
So it gets lost in the sea of noise and partisanship.
It does, and I kind of wish that Google and Facebook and Twitter would get better at bringing us those alternative views and those more closer to the ground views. You know, I don't know if this will ever happen, but in my dream Facebook world, if a bunch of my friends are posting conservative articles from redstate.com and Town Hall and Free Republic, I would love then for Facebook's algorithm to know that and then give me some liberal articles too. You know, just to give me some dissenting opinions. I don't know if they'll ever do that, but in my dream world, that's what would happen.
And that's the filter bubble gets into this issue because they say it's the exact opposite. It's assuming that, you must like all this conservative or all these liberal articles because those are your friends, those are the articles you're liking. We'll give you more of those unless that's going to contradict the point of view.
Right. And that is just borderline scary. It's scary, it is. The idea that we're only going to have what we believe reinforced. I'd like to think, though, and again, this is me being optimistic, that we're better than that. That there's always been people on the extremes who only listen to what they want to listen to. And even before broadcasting, they were just buying the newspaper that agreed with them in their local community. I'd like to believe that most of us do seek out other sides. I don't know if that's true, but I think it is. I hope it is. I mean, from what I experience with what I would call normal people, not people like me who live and breathe and eat this stuff, it's that they still do. They're curious enough about the world. They still want to read the other side's point of view. And whenever I get too frustrated, I think, well, we have elections. Everybody at least has to, most of the time, agree on the results of the elections. You know, even if we live in our own little bubbles and we believe in our own realities, we have to, every 2 years or so, come to grips with the fact that someone won and someone lost. And at least that can break through the bubble.
Well, I'm encouraged by your optimism.
Maybe I'm just young and naive.
That's good to hear. I was just going to take a break right here and see if anyone had any questions that they would like to ask. Be bold, be brave about...
Try to stump me about the times or about anything else.
Right.
So I got like a zillion questions, but I'll just try to think of one. You talked about, I don't even know how to start this, but the whole notion of stories getting play, right, and getting picked up, right? For example, that there's these small niche markets, and they might have access to something that everybody could really use, but we don't know about it. Contrast that with the New York Times, right? It's on the front page of the New York Times, then everybody who's vaguely interested could find out about that. But there, as you know, there's challenges with that, right? All you have to do is look at the Iraq War, right? And all the reporting from people like Judith Miller, right? And all that kind of stuff. which got onto the front page and helped propel the story forward, especially about there being sort of like chemical weapons in Iraq, for example. And that kind of reporting really helped push the story and help the agenda of the administration. And my question is related to sources, right? We see a lot more increase in the use of anonymous sources. And so my understanding, I'm not a journalist, so my really naive understanding is that, you know, there's a kind of that didn't used to be the case, right? And then it became more and more. Watergate was an example where that blew off the roof. But sources have now become more and more like quoting anonymous people from administration, right? And quoting anonymous people in power. And so newspapers are becoming more, I mean, the critique is that newspapers are becoming more of a mouthpiece for those in power, right? And just sort of becoming a PR for them as opposed to actually really fact checking. I mean, again, Judith Miller is a great example of just repeating stuff, right? The people in power wanted to get their message out. I mean, if you want to take the hard line critique of it. So I'm wondering about your idea, or if you could comment on this critique of media about the rise of anonymous sources, especially from people in positions of power, and how that, your view of that, how that's affected media, positive, negative, and what, if it's negative, what could be done about that, or anyway, stuff like that.
I'll give you first my defense of anonymous sources, and then I completely agree with you that there are dangers with it. I'm amazed at how often on my beat, because I write about TV and media, so I write about the people that make media, how often they won't talk on the record. They refuse to have their names attached to quotes. They're paranoid, but you know what? They have reason to be. I mean, for the most part, if you work at Time Warner or Comcast or even the New York Times Company, if you speak publicly to a reporter, and you're not supposed to, and if you say anything even slightly critical of the company, let me rephrase. That's not true of the New York Times, because people are critical. But Time Warner, Comcast, Disney, these big media companies, you speak out of line, and you're quoted publicly doing it, you're going to get disciplined, and you're going to fear for your job. I have had in one instance a source fired for speaking to me, and of course they didn't know for sure they spoke to me because I couldn't name the source, right? But they went on one of the networks, went on a witch hunt, figured out who they thought the source was, fired the person. So there's a real level of intimidation for people to talk to the press. And we see it all the time. There was a state government employee in New York who was forced out a little while ago because he gave positive quotes to a local newspaper about their response to Hurricane Irene. And still the state government forced him out. I mean, there is such an effort these days by people in positions of power, whether it's corporate or government power, to control who's quoted and what information gets out. So we have to use anonymous sources, even for rather basic stories, even about the media. We have to, but we need to do a better job of explaining that to readers. You know, if I have to use an anonymous source, I need to make clear to my readers why I had to. And sometimes we don't follow those guidelines often enough. I try to explain in my stories that when I'm quoting someone anonymously, it's because they fear retribution. It's because they fear for their job. But we need to do a really clear job of making that obvious. And one of the problems with that is sometimes it's not because they fear for the jobs. Sometimes it's just because they're trying to get their point of view out in a way that is manipulating the press. And certainly we see that in political coverage all the time. People just, jockeying for position and hiding under a banner of anonymity. In cases where that's happening, I hope and I think my editors try to restrict it and limit it as much as we can. But it's a problem in political reporting, I think. The other problem with anonymous sources is if they get information wrong, they give us the facts that are wrong, they need to be, for lack of a better word, punished. We see this during the shooting at Sandy Hook in December. Federal officials anonymously told television news networks and newspapers that the shooter was Ryan Lanza, when in fact it was the brother, Adam. So Ryan Lanza's name was ruined, right? His Facebook wall was filled up with hate and vile. And he was in mourning as his brother just killed himself and killed 20 people. That was because of anonymous federal sources who gave the wrong facts to reporters. Not that they knew the facts were wrong, they thought they were given the right information. But when those sources got it wrong, when we realized those sources were wrong, I would have liked for there to be more,
either out the sources, which you probably should not do, or make very clear who, why we got it wrong, right? Because it makes the reporters look bad when in fact they're relaying information from sources that actually look bad. That's a very tricky spot. Yeah, that's the right word, accountability. I mean, I do believe that in this digital media age, people that get it right generally do get rewarded with more credibility, more page views, more trust. And people that get it wrong hopefully get a little bit of a dent in their reputation. CNN is a great example of that. Last year, CNN got the Supreme Court ruling on Obamacare wrong. For about 6 minutes, they had the wrong information. They said that the whole law had been thrown out. I think CNN took a real credibility shot that day. I think 1 or 2%, they really, took a, and they should have been wounded. So hopefully people are a little more skeptical of CNN now. Not a lot, they get most things right. But when they make a mistake that big, there should be a little bit of accountability afterwards.
Brian, you were raising your hand, did you?
Yeah, I didn't want to jump ahead of it, but by the way, CNN lost credibility quite some time ago. But a quick statement. I have 2 questions, but I'll wait for the second one later if somebody else wants to ask. When I grew up in a military family, and I was in first grade toward the end of Vietnam, and I grew up in the 70s with my dad only watching John Chancellor, and would not watch Walter Cronkite after Walter Cronkite went to Vietnam, came back and said, "We can't win this war, it's not happening, what I saw is not what's matching up with what the government's telling us." And so, as a military man, he couldn't watch that anymore. But Walter Cronkite, as you know, single-handedly started to turn the tide on the Vietnam War as far as the home front and how we viewed that war, which was the beginning of the end for many people would argue. So fast forward 40 years later, we're going into Iraq, and you have watched network news now. Speaking just of network television broadcast news now, and not cable news. The networks, as I remember, never really vetted out the administration's reasons for going to war in Iraq. And as we've seen so much of the documentaries were made about that time, almost promoted the American patriotism at the time. Now, history is going to show, and is starting to show, that there was a lot of reasons not to go to war in Iraq, just as there were to go to war in Iraq. What blame, if any, do those networks share for that war?
Remember dinner 2 nights ago? Yeah. So if you guys can keep a secret, that's exactly the story I'm working on right now.
Oh.
Because the 10-year anniversary, next month, is the 10-year anniversary. And here's the thrust of the story, as far as I see it now. The New York Times has been rightly criticized for leading the way into that war in terms of press by running front-page stories that were wrong, with information that was wrong. And the New York Times, gotta give them credit, atoned for the sins. We published an editor's note, we've addressed repeatedly the mistakes that were made. The editor-in-chief was fired. Other reporters were quietly let go. We have all these changes that have happened now. Hopefully we wouldn't do it again. Hopefully it wouldn't happen again. The television networks haven't taken responsibility though. We haven't seen them apologize. We haven't seen anchors come on and say, here's how we did this wrong. I was struck by the fact that this week MSNBC, which is NBC's liberal cable news channel, ran a documentary about this issue. They ran a documentary about how the government, using the media, misled us into war. It got about 1.5 million viewers. I thought to myself, that's great. That's really cool. Wow, a lot of viewers for a documentary about a 10-year-old thing. But why wasn't that on NBC? Why wasn't that forced onto the network and not just for a bunch of liberal viewers to watch? Why wasn't the rest of the country showing that documentary? So I am trying to do that story. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go back and interview executives and anchors who were there at the time, who are no longer there, and talk to them about what pressure they felt to portray the war in a positive light, to not ask tough questions. Because it's absolutely true that anchors like Katie Couric were told to lay off, not to be too tough on the government ahead of the invasion. And that's in part just because there was a sense of patriotism in the country, and the companies that own these networks didn't want to appear unpatriotic. And that's a form of pressure in and of itself. So I'm going to write that story, and frankly, I'm glad it came up in the first 2 questions because it's getting me excited to go and do it. It's the kind of thing that you couldn't write at the time because nobody was willing to talk. It would have had to be all anonymous, and even then, I'm not sure people like Katie Couric would have talked about it. But now that 10 years have passed, I think people can be more honest about what pressure they felt, not to ask tough questions, basically not to show dissent. And maybe hopefully now they will open up. We'll see. Yeah. probably in the second inning of that combination now, with a ways to go. But I am a firm believer that we will not see a difference between television and that it will feel like the same thing in the future. On my beat, which is mainly television, I think of my beat now as video, all video, because television is just one form of video. YouTube is another form of video. Netflix is another form of video. Some of it's entertainment, some of it's news. And we're seeing so much blurring of those lines that they are becoming hard to blur. It's becoming hard to tell the difference. Just to kind of frame it as an example, think about what the iPad and the iPhone, what all smartphones do to the media. On my cell phone, there's no difference at all between the New York Times, NPR on radio, CNN on TV, Al Jazeera, BBC, etc. They're all the same, right? Because they're all producing news. Some are doing a little more video, some are doing a little more audio, some are doing a little more text. But CNN writes stories, and NPR films video, and the New York Times does live video newscasts, and the BBC has lots of radio and print reporters, and so they're all becoming the same. And I think that's an example of what we're seeing. We're seeing all of those blur and all become news organizations. Now, for the New York Times, that means we have to compete with CNN, BBC, and Al Jazeera, and that's pretty intimidating. But it's also quite exciting, for us to be doing video newscasts, and for me to be sending in video and I'm on assignment. I think it's a good thing for reporters. The Wall Street Journal, which we all think of as a newspaper, does about 4 hours of live video a day. They're secretly CNBC. They just don't call themselves a TV network, but they're secretly a TV network. And I think we'll see more and more go in that direction, which again I think is a pretty cool thing. Even though we don't have the right language for it yet. Like what is Netflix? Is it television? Is it streaming? We don't have they just produced a show that's as good as anything on HBO, but it's only on the internet. So we kind of need new words to describe this stuff. But I do believe we will get to the 9th inning where the internet's just a delivery mechanism for everything, including television and radio and everything else.
Well, I was thinking about that in terms of, we talk about it primarily in the form of blogging, but in YouTube, that seems to has been the leveling agent for ordinary videographers and people producing. I mean, we saw
It has been,
this
yeah.
about Tony
And it'll continue more in that way. I remember almost 2 years ago now, I went to Chicago to cover Oprah Winfrey's last daytime talk show taping. But that morning, the night before, is when the tornado went through Joplin. And I'm a weather nerd, and the Times knows that. So when I landed in Chicago at 6 a.m., I said, "Do you need more reporters from Joplin?" They said yes, so I flew to Kansas City and drove, and got there by noon. I was pretty late, but I didn't contribute much that day. I just tried to help with what little reporting I could do. But what I just realized when I arrived there was that the most important thing I could do for the New York Times at that moment at noon was not a newspaper story, it was not a blog post, it was video. It was, so the first thing I did was film the video and send it to the paper. The second thing I did was a telephone interview because we needed audio. Third thing I did was Instagram pictures, because at that moment on that kind of story, the most valuable thing is visuals. The articles came later, they were much less important. And I think what's amazing about the internet is it allows for those decisions to be made, right? Where every article, every story can be told differently. A lot of stories still are best told as articles. There's no better way to tell the story of Nielsen changing its rating system that I can think of, other than a 1,000-word print story, because that's just the way to get your arms around it. But for other stories, video is better, audio is better, and the fact that we can do all of those now is a great opportunity for us, and hopefully a way forward out of this giant business problem we have. Our advertising revenues are like this. Sometimes they're more like that. It's like a ski slope that you wouldn't want to ski. And yet our subscription revenue is growing, and what we need to do is to get that to grow faster and grow higher to offset all of the advertising that we're losing, because it really is we've lost more than half of our advertising revenue. So we need to make that up somehow. I think one of the ways we can make it up is by producing more and better content for subscribers, making stuff people are willing to pay for. They're willing to pay for Netflix, and they're willing to pay for their Starbucks coffee in the morning. They have all these different things they're used to paying for on a daily or weekly or monthly basis. And the New York Times can hopefully increasingly be one of those things. So that's a tangent, but that's my advertisement.
Other questions? Yes, Dan?
Being in a position of prominence in the New York Times, I'm sure, and because of your blog, you get thousands, if not tens of thousands, of tips and suggestions for coverage. And I'm wondering about one of the logistics of actually weeding through those. You have a lot of people helping you. Number two, beyond that, how do you verify these sources? And would you comment on the ethics of reporting something that you haven't verified? Do you ever do it, or is that a practice you wish to do?
I wish I had an intern to help me with my email, but no, I do it by myself, and I don't get thousands of tips, but I get a lot. I get hundreds of emails a day, and a lot of them are PR people pitching stories, most of which I can just immediately throw away. I have a real email problem. You've noticed this problem. I either email within seconds or I never reply. I need to get better at that. But I do try to reply to people quickly and tell them yes, I can write about it, or no, I can't. And the hurdle for me is knowing just what is the most important story to write that day, because there's so much to write about right now about television and media and journalism. There's no shortage of stories. The challenge is figuring out what is the best story to do, and I frequently rely on my editors for that. When I got to the paper, I probably rather pompously didn't realize the extent to which editors were going to be important, in my life. Being able to tell me this matters, this doesn't matter, do this, don't do this. That was a really, I didn't appreciate how important that would be. With regards to sourcing and verifying, I can't think of a time where we would publish something without checking first. That doesn't mean that we always have confirmation for something we publish, though. Last year, when I was in the middle of my book reporting about morning TV, I broke the story that Ann Curry was in negotiations to get booted off the Today Show. And I had known it for a few weeks, but I hadn't been sure enough to do a story in the paper. And as I got more confident about it from different sources who were coming in different directions, one of my concerns was, is this being leaked on purpose? So I went to other people we tried to look for independent sources. So someone over here who didn't know someone over here. And if I heard it from both those sides, and I was confident they weren't talking, and I was confident that I wasn't, the other concern I had was, I wanted to make sure I wasn't creating an echo of my own rumor. Sometimes what will happen is we'll start calling around and asking questions like, is Ann Curry being fired? And it'll start to echo back to you. Because people who you call will call other people and start to spread the same thing. So as I became confident that I wasn't the victim of my own echo chamber, I put the story online. But NBC didn't admit it to me, they didn't confirm it, and so I didn't have the proof per se from the network. What I did have, though, was the PR person not deny it. And honestly, sometimes not denying it is good enough for us. If we have 5 sources who are all sure of something, and we give a company proper amount of time to deny it, and they don't, then sometimes that is good enough. I can't think of an instance where we've been burned in a big way by that. But we are always able to update and correct things or improve stories for the web after they're up. I mean, it's not that we make mistakes and fix them, but sometimes we're missing details that are important, so we can add them to our stories, and that's important. The great thing about the web is it's self-healing, right? If you do post something, it's not finished, it's not complete. If you spell a name wrong or something, you can fix it within seconds. And usually your readers will tell you when something's wrong and help you fix it. So that's a rather magical quality of the web that we didn't have 20 years ago.
But like you said, that transparency of saying, well, we did change this name. Because I notice the Times does that a lot, is make clear when a new version comes up and the name has been fixed or something.
Right. It's important to remember that the people we read about are real people. And it's sometimes easy to forget that we affect lives. I mean, I don't want to sound silly or highfalutin about it, but stories we write affect people, right? We can hurt feelings, or we can help careers. And I think there's I've felt a danger in forgetting that, and I'm happy to be reminded of that sometimes. I was told by Ann Curry's friends that if Brian hadn't written that damn story, then she could have left with dignity, and she wouldn't have cried on television and broken down. Arguably, her breaking down caused the show to lose its ratings and actually fall in second place for the rest of the year. It's all, you could argue lots of different ways. I don't take credit or blame for that. But the fact that she felt that way, the fact that she felt that I took away her ability to say goodbye, resonated with me. It was a good reminder that we affect people. We should be whenever possible, very careful and very gentle and very thorough.
Have you ever talked to her about it?
I haven't been able to, no, because NBC won't allow interviews, unfortunately. But I hope someday I can write another book that'll follow up and explain more, but more what she thinks. I've actually been very lucky that relatively few people have written about the crazy drama of morning TV this year in the newspapers and online. There's lots of rumors on the web. If you Google Matt Lauer and Inquiry, you'll find lots of crazy nastiness out there, but been very few people who've actually tried to report about it. Which is good for me. It's probably, it's maybe bad for readers. They might be curious about it. There's not much out there, but it's good for me because it'll be in my book. And I've been thankful to do it. It's been a fun little project to do.
Any other time for about Greg?
Well, I was just going to ask you, can you talk a little bit about how bloggers don't have to have that same sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? They don't have to source the same degree that the Times does. And so you can get stories out there like Friends of Hamas.
Right.
And suddenly take on life of its own, and it becomes news. I mean, how do we, I mean, there are people that are genuinely confused when those sorts of things happen.
Yeah.
And how do you reconcile that?
I wish in some cases we could have warning labels on these sites, all these articles that, almost like nutritional facts in stores that warn, this is not good for your health, And frankly, I wish we could do that for our own stories. If we know that government officials have a history of lying about war in wartime, maybe we should have a giant red sticker that says, warning, in the past, government officials have been known to lie. Just to kind of put it in context. Unfortunately, we don't, and I think we're probably going to have to see journalism, nonpartisan journalism, work harder in the future to fact check other reporting that's out there and correct other reporting that's out there. Because in the past, there's been an inclination to, if something crazy is written on the internet, just ignore it, and maybe it'll go away. I don't know if that works. Maybe what we have to be is more forceful about correcting things that are out there. I'm trying to think of an example of that, of things that bubble up that we know are untrue, but that some people start to believe. And maybe the Friends of Hamas case is an example. It was an example of Chuck Hagel being tarred by something that was a joke, but not everybody knew it was a joke, so people ran with it and tried to attack him. Maybe the Times had needed to write a story that said, this was wrong and here's who was wrong and why. But I don't have a good solution to that as someone who's just one of many reporters there. It is a challenge, though, that comes from the fact that everybody can be a publisher. And the opportunity is that anybody who's written about wrongly or falsely or disagrees can also be a publisher. And so hopefully they can publish with just the same amount of amplification that the original person could. Senator Menendez, I'm hoping to pronounce his name, in New Jersey, has been attacked this way recently. He's a Democrat in New Jersey. Someone put a blog up about him, alleging prostitution visits, alleging all these different things. And he has now started to respond and deny these allegations. But this blog is up there. It's got all these documents. It's got all these allegations. And it's totally anonymous. It's a really tough situation for a public official. Maybe he should have created his own blog with his own answers or something like that to try to respond. But it is a really thorny issue, and one that I don't personally have a solution for.
If you had $100 million, would you buy the Boston Globe? And going forward, how would you change it to
how we're going to add value? To be honest, I haven't read the Boston Globe site. I don't read the paper, so I don't know what their challenges are in particular. But if I had to guess, I would guess that they could use more reporters, and they could use more reporters covering things that other people aren't covering. The bane of my existence is when I show up to a story, and there's 20 other people there, and I just know they're going to do a better job than I am. That someone's going to write the best version of that story. And what are the other 19 of us doing there? You see that with court trials all the time. You see that with crime all the time. You see that with the White House beat. You see 50 reporters at a press conference, and most of them aren't even going to get called on. I get it, it's a prestigious beat. But what if 40 of those reporters were out finding out something that wasn't being written about? That to me is a much more valuable use of the time. And you know, I get it. I had the 3 of the 4 stories I wrote yesterday were versions of stories that had already been written by someone else. But I had to because we felt like we had to cover them as well. But the most valuable story I wrote yesterday was about an anchor who's leaving CNN, going off doing her own thing. And it was valuable because no one else had written it yet, and she was talking to me exclusively. So I always, every day, try to do more of that stuff that you can't find anywhere else, and less of the derivative stuff. And maybe the answer for these smaller newspapers like the Boston Globe, and then even smaller than that, is to try to stop almost entirely doing the derivative stuff and concentrate almost exclusively on the real original stuff. So if another newspaper broke the story, just link to them. Give them a link, give them credit, and move on. Unless you think there's something more to add, don't try to rewrite it, right? And I think that's true for journalism students as well. The way to stand out these days is to be indispensable, is to do something no one else does, even if it's small, to do something nobody else does. Because there's plenty of people already writing about, the sequester. And there's plenty of people already writing about the blizzard. Find a story no one else is writing, and hopefully that's a way to stand out. And then from there, hopefully that's a way to gain an audience and gain their revenue. And in the future, it's going to be much more, it seems like it's going to be much more about getting money from subscribers. And what are people going to subscribe to? They're going to subscribe to things that are special, that are unique, that they can't find for free.
Do you think there's, when you gauge the attitudes of these network newsrooms, is there hope that those newsrooms improve their product, that they're able to do better coverage? Look at CBS, for example, right now. The one thing they're really kind of pounding on is original reporting.
Right.
And promos about it. Scott Pelley, under them, they wanted to do more foreign and economic reporting. Do you see the possibility of any of the networks getting better at news coverage?
I do, and not only the networks, but also the new channels that are popping up. We're in a golden age right now of access to reporting from around the world. We see Al Jazeera trying to get on cable in the United States. The BBC is trying to get on cable in the United States. Weirdly, I have access to Russia Today in my house. I have access to Chinese state TV. I've got access to France TV. There's all these international networks that are trying to do news in the U.S. And between them and between the network news divisions, we've actually got a great variety of sources. In some cases, we have to go seek them out, though, which is a bit of a pain. But I'm hopeful in that way that there are more people sprouting up trying to do more reporting. And what I like about the network newsrooms right now, NBC, ABC, and CBS, which are still the main way we get most of our news, is that they're trying to all be really different from one another. For a long time, if you turned on NBC Nightly News, CBS Evening News, ABC World News Tonight, you had the same top story pretty much every night. Same top story, same second story. It probably would have been the budget debate and then the blizzard yesterday on all 3. Now they pretty much all lead every night with something different. They're all trying to be different. They're all trying to be original. That's kind of what I'm talking about with newspapers. They're all trying to find stories no one else is doing. And that's a good thing. Even though ABC seems softer, fluffier, lighter, tabloid is a word you might use for ABC. CBS is going really hard, really serious. Foreign news, economic news. NBC is sort of like Goldilocks in the middle, trying to be like the right warm suit. But I think it's good they're all trying to differentiate. That even though they are suffering from cutbacks, and even though I wish there was more overseas reporting, at least it's good that they're all trying to be unique and not trying to be derivative. And that is what gives me hope for them.
One thing we haven't really talked much about here, we talk a lot about blogging, web, print, television. We haven't talked a lot about social media. And I just wondered, I know you've got, over 100,000 followers on Twitter. You use Twitter a lot.
I've been checking it during this to see what people are saying about the conversation. I have.
Can you tell me where do you view social media fitting into this media landscape, and which of them do you feel are the most important?
I view Twitter and Facebook as 2 main things for journalists. They are a hugely valuable marketing tool. They're a giant megaphone to broadcast our stories, to promote our work, to promote our institutions, hopefully to get you to pay for the New York Times. And then they're also the world's best antenna to know what people are talking about, what they care about, what stories they want to read. is probably true to say that journalists as a whole have in the past not cared enough what their audience wanted. Certainly some are better than others at that, but the web and social media in particular, Twitter in particular, makes us pay more attention to what our readers want and what they want to know more about. For me last year, my most viewed article on the Times site was Keith Olbermann being fired from Current TV. A couple of reasons. One, he's a liberal icon. He essentially gave the anti-war movement a voice on television in the mid-2000s after the Iraq War started. Number two, he's kind of a blowhard. People either love him or hate him. He's a polarizing guy, so he gets a lot of page views. And what was notable to me about that was Twitter blew up when I broke the story about him getting fired. Facebook blew up, and it told me people want to know more about this. So I wrote a couple follow-ups because I knew my audience cared. So that was very valuable to me. I got a sense that people wanted to know more and was able to use that information and benefit from it. The antenna that I talk about, it also turns me on to stories I should be covering. It lets me know about things I should be doing. And that's really useful. And it makes me a better reporter. It makes me a better journalist. Even the complaints, even the criticism, it can be rather harsh. It's still a good thing to hear. It's still a good. I even put my cell phone number on my Twitter biography because I want people to be able to call. Sometimes I send them a voicemail if I know the person who's calling. But I want them to know they can send me ideas and tips and things like that. So that's how I think of it: a big marketing tool and a great listening tool. To hear what people are thinking. I wish we could do even more with Facebook because it is such a huge amount of people's lives, a big piece of people's lives, and no one in the industry, in the media world, has figured out how to really tap into that and reach people